The corridor outside the west schoolroom was unusually silent when the duty guard noticed a small damp handprint on the painted wall, far too low to belong to any servant. He slowed. A moment later, Princess Anne emerged, gripping the young heir firmly by the arm. As the child turned, the guard saw raw lash marks across the back of the tunic and realized something inside the palace was very wrong. The school wing of the palace was always quiet after the afternoon lessons concluded, but the quiet that evening carried a different quality, dense, contained, as if sound itself had been pressed flat against the walls. The guard paused just inside the secondary corridor, letting the door close behind him without noise. The air smelled faintly of chalk and polish, but beneath it lingered another trace, something metallic and dry that did not belong in a place meant for children. He moved forward at a measured pace, boots landing softly on the narrow runner carpet that dampened every step. Halfway down the corridor, he saw the first irregularity, a handprint on the painted wall, low enough to belong to a child, faint but visible where the light from the high windows struck at an angle. He stopped, studying it without touching it. The print was smeared, as if made by a hand that had slipped while trying to steady itself. A few steps farther, near the entrance to a small instruction room, he noticed the second sign. One of the small wooden stools lay on its side, not broken, not damaged, simply fallen in a way that suggested abrupt movement rather than carelessness. The guard crouched, observing the floor. There were no signs of a struggle in the usual sense, no scattered books, no torn fabric, no overturned tables. Everything else remained orderly, almost deliberately so, as though someone had restored the room in haste but overlooked minor details. He straightened and listened. The silence felt deliberate, not natural. Even the distant sounds of the palace seemed muted here, as though the thick stone and heavy doors had sealed the wing into its own stillness. The guard withdrew his small log tablet and began recording what he observed, speaking softly into the recorder so as not to disturb the quiet. He described the handprint, the stool, the absence of authorized activity in the wing at that hour. Protocol required precision, not speculation. When he finished, he checked the corridor schedule on the internal system. The entries showed the wing had been cleared and locked for cleaning 2 hours earlier, with no subsequent bookings, no disciplinary sessions, no private instruction, no physical training, nothing that would explain a child's injury or distress. He felt the faint tightening in his chest that came when procedure and observation did not align. It was not fear, but a form of alertness, the sense that something small had shifted out of place in a system designed to leave nothing to chance. He moved deeper into the wing, passing closed classroom doors, each one secured, each one silent. At the far end of the corridor, he noticed the third sign, a narrow streak on the polished floor, barely visible, as if something damp had been dragged and then wiped away. He stood there for several seconds, looking at it, aware that what he was seeing did not yet constitute evidence of wrongdoing, only of irregularity. Yet irregularities, in his experience, were rarely accidental in a palace where every movement was scheduled, every room accounted for. He turned toward the small administrative office, where access logs were stored locally, intending to verify the entries directly rather than rely on the central system. As he reached for the handle, he noticed that the office door, which should have been locked, stood slightly ajar. The guard did not open the office door immediately. He stood still, listening, allowing his breathing to slow until he could distinguish the faintest sounds within the room. There was nothing, no movement, no rustle of paper, no shifting of furniture. Only the distant hum of the palace ventilation, steady and indifferent. He pushed the door inward with controlled pressure, careful not to let it creak. The office lights were off, but the late daylight filtering through the narrow window gave enough illumination to see the outlines of the desk, the filing cabinet, and the wall console where local access records were stored. Nothing appeared disturbed at first glance, yet the chair behind the desk was angled slightly away, as though someone had risen from it in haste and not bothered to straighten it. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, and approached the console. The screen activated at his touch, displaying the local log entries. He compared them methodically to the central schedule he had already reviewed. At first they matched: cleaning crew entry, exit, lock confirmation. But then he noticed a gap, an interval of 11 minutes during which no activity was recorded at all. In a system that logged every door cycle and identification scan automatically, an absence of entries is itself an anomaly. He checked the internal clock. It was functioning normally. The gap was real. He recorded the finding in his log, keeping his voice low and even, careful to state only what could be verified. When he finished, he remained standing there looking at the blank interval on the screen. 11 minutes was long enough for many things to occur, and short enough to be overlooked by anyone not looking carefully. Protocol required him to forward the preliminary observation through internal channels and await instruction. Normally, that process was efficient, measured in minutes rather than hours. But this wing was not an ordinary part of the palace. Among the small number of children who used these classrooms was the princess, the youngest member of the royal household, whose lessons were conducted here under strict privacy. Any report involving her presence would pass through additional layers of review, each one slower, each one more cautious. The guard felt the weight of that knowledge settle over his thoughts. Delay, in most cases, was merely inconvenient. In matters involving a vulnerable child, delay could mean something else entirely. He secured the console and stepped back into the corridor, closing the office door firmly behind him. The silence of the wing seemed heavier now, pressing against his ears. As he began walking toward the exit, he noticed one more detail he had missed before. Near the base of the wall, partly hidden by the shadow of a cabinet, lay a small object, a ribbon, pale in color, the kind used to tie a child's hair. He bent and picked it up carefully, holding it in the fading light. The ribbon was creased, and one edge bore a faint dark stain. He stood there for a long moment, the corridor empty around him, aware that what he held in his hand was no longer merely an irregularity, but the first unmistakable sign that a child had been hurt in a place where no harm should ever occur. The following morning, the guard reported for duty along the inner residential corridor, a route that passed at measured intervals near the heir's private chambers and the small receiving hall where tutors and attendants gathered before escorting the child to lessons. The corridor was warm compared to the stone passages of the outer palace, heated subtly through concealed vents, and carried the faint scent of polished wood and tea. Morning light filtered through tall windows, laying pale rectangles across the carpet. From a distance, nothing appeared unusual. Attendants moved in their normal rhythm, voices low, footsteps controlled. Yet as the guard took his assigned position near a junction, he began to observe details that others might overlook. The heir emerged from the chambers accompanied by a lady attendant, walking at a careful pace that was slower than usual. The child's posture was slightly rigid, the right arm held closer to the body than natural balance required. The guard did not stare. Training had long ago taught him to observe without appearing to watch. He shifted his gaze to the corridor ahead while noting the movement in peripheral vision, registering each detail as part of routine awareness. When the heir passed within several paces, he saw faint discoloration at the edge of the child's sleeve where the fabric met the wrist, yellowing and pale blue, the unmistakable tones of a recent bruise. The attendant spoke softly to the child, asking whether the morning air felt too cool, whether the lesson materials had been prepared, questions that sounded ordinary but carried an undercurrent of careful distraction. The child answered in brief, quiet words, never looking up. The guard felt the same tightening of alertness he had experienced in the school wing, but stronger now, sharpened by proximity. Protocol did not permit him to question a royal child directly without cause, and injuries, unless officially reported, did not yet constitute grounds for intervention. Yet the memory of the ribbon in his evidence pouch, sealed and logged the night before, remained vivid in his thoughts. As the heir and attendant moved down the corridor, the child's step faltered almost imperceptibly near a turn, a brief hesitation that suggested discomfort rather than fatigue. The attendant's hand moved quickly to steady the shoulder, too quickly, as if anticipating the stumble. The guard noted the reflex, the tension in the attendant's grip, and the way it was released almost immediately, replaced by a composed, gentle posture. Everything outwardly proper, yet not entirely natural. When the pair reached the receiving hall, the guard resumed a slow patrol, passing the doorway at a distance that allowed him to hear fragments of ordinary conversation. The rustle of papers, the quiet greeting of a tutor, the clink of porcelain. No raised voices, no urgency. The surface of palace life remained intact, smooth and undisturbed. Yet beneath that surface, the guard sensed the same deliberate stillness he had felt in the school wing, a quiet maintained by effort rather than ease. He continued his patrol, recording routine observations at each checkpoint, but his attention returned again and again to the child's measured steps and the guarded expression that had replaced the open curiosity he remembered from previous weeks. Late in the morning, as the lesson period ended, the guard was stationed near a narrower passage that connected the instructional rooms to the private garden corridor. The route was rarely crowded, used mainly by tutors and occasionally by the children when weather permitted outdoor study. He stood at his post, listening to the distant murmur of voices fading as attendants guided others away. A few minutes later, the heir appeared at the far end of the passage, walking alone for several steps before an attendant emerged behind at a slower pace, occupied with a stack of books. The guard recognized the brief interval as one of those small, unscripted moments that occurred even within the palace's careful order. As the child approached, he inclined his head in the formal, neutral acknowledgement appropriate to his position. The heir slowed, then stopped a few paces away, as if uncertain whether to continue. For a moment, neither spoke. The guard kept his posture relaxed, neither inviting conversation nor discouraging it, allowing the silence to remain unforced. At last, in a quiet voice, he said only, "Are your lessons proceeding well today, Your Highness?" The question was ordinary, one he had used many times in passing, neutral enough to attract no notice. The child hesitated, then nodded, but the movement was stiff, constrained. Up close, the guard could see faint marks near the collarbone, partly hidden by the edge of the uniform tunic, discolorations that were too recent to have faded. He did not look directly at them. Instead, he let his gaze rest on the middle distance, giving the child the dignity of not being openly examined. "Does it hurt?" he asked quietly, the words so soft they barely carried beyond the space between them. The heir's eyes lifted briefly, wide with something that was not merely pain, but apprehension. The child shook her head at first, then, after a pause, gave the smallest nod. No further explanation followed. Footsteps sounded behind as the attendant approached, and the child's expression changed at once, the guarded stillness returning like a curtain drawn across a window. Without another word, the heir continued down the passage. The guard remained where he stood, watching only after the child had turned the corner. The exchange had lasted less than a minute, yet it left no doubt in his mind that the injuries were recent and that the child was afraid to speak. Fear in a royal child was not by itself proof of wrongdoing. The weight of expectation and discipline often produced silence. Yet this silence felt different, controlled, watchful, the silence of someone measuring every word. The guard recorded the interaction in his private observation log as soon as he returned to the nearest terminal, careful to state only what he had seen and heard, avoiding interpretation. As he secured the entry, he understood with growing clarity that waiting for a formal inquiry, bound by layers of approval and discretion, might leave the child exposed to whatever had already caused those injuries. And for the first time since he had taken the oath of service, he felt the full weight of a question that protocol alone could not answer. How long could a guard observe in silence before observation itself became a form of neglect? The guard submitted his preliminary observation report just after midday, routing it through the internal security channel designated for welfare concerns involving minors of the royal household. The process required precision and restraint. Every sentence had to describe only what had been directly observed, locations, times, physical details, without inference or accusation. He reviewed the report twice before transmitting it, ensuring that the language remained strictly factual. When the file left his terminal, a quiet confirmation tone sounded, and for a moment the routine of procedure offered a sense of order, as if the system itself would now carry the matter forward. By late afternoon, however, no acknowledgement had appeared in the tracking log. Normally, reports of this classification generated at least an automated response within an hour. The absence of one was itself unusual. The guard continued his duties, walking the assigned patrol routes, exchanging formal greetings with other personnel, maintaining the outward rhythm of an ordinary shift. Yet his attention remained divided, returning again and again to the report's silent status indicator. Near the end of his watch, a message arrived on his secured communicator, instructing him to report to a private administrative office in the inner court. The request was marked routine, but the sender's credentials identified a senior court official, one whose authority extended over household operations rather than security. The distinction was subtle but significant. The office lay in a quieter section of the palace, away from the corridors frequented by guards. When he entered, the room was dimly lit, but tall windows shaded against the late sun. The official sat behind a narrow desk, reviewing a document that the guard recognized, after a brief glance, as a printed copy of his own report. The man did not look up immediately, allowing the silence to lengthen before speaking. When he did, his tone was measured, almost courteous, but carried an undercurrent of firmness that left little doubt about the purpose of the meeting. He explained that matters concerning the royal children were handled with particular discretion, and that premature or unverified reports could cause unnecessary alarm. The guard listened without interrupting, standing at attention, hands clasped behind his back. The official turned a page of the report and remarked that certain descriptions, references to injuries, irregular access logs, and unverified incidents in the school wing were, in his words, incomplete observations that might be misinterpreted if circulated beyond a narrow administrative circle. Then he slid a revised document across the desk. It was a version of the report with several passages removed, replaced by neutral phrasing that referred only to routine inspection and no significant findings. The implication required no explanation. The guard felt the quiet tightening in his chest again, stronger than before, but his expression remained composed. He understood the structure of authority within the palace. The official before him possessed legitimate power over many internal matters, and direct refusal carried consequences not only for his career, but for his continued access to the areas where he might still observe and protect. The official spoke again, his voice calm, almost sympathetic, emphasizing that the palace functions on trust and discretion. He suggested that the guard amend the original entry in the system to match the revised wording, describing it as a correction rather than an alteration. Accuracy, he said, sometimes requires restraint as much as detail. The words were delivered without threat, yet the meaning was unmistakable. The guard requested permission to review the revised document. The official nodded, and the guard read it carefully, noting each omission, the handprint, the access log gap, the bruising observed on the child. The revision did not deny these things, it simply erased them, leaving a record that suggested nothing unusual had occurred. He placed the document back on the desk with deliberate care. For a few seconds, neither spoke. The guard was aware of the faint ticking of a wall clock and the distant echo of footsteps in the corridor beyond the closed door. In that quiet, he understood the full weight of what was being asked, not merely obedience, but the quiet removal of a record that might later prove essential. His oath required him to follow lawful orders, yet it also required him to protect those under royal care, especially those unable to protect themselves. The two obligations now stood in conflict, not dramatically, not with raised voices or overt coercion, but in the quiet, controlled manner that characterized most decisions in the palace. At length, he said only that he would need to review the procedural guidance for amending submitted reports to ensure compliance with security regulations. The statement was neutral, neither agreement nor refusal. The official studied him for a moment, then inclined his head slightly, granting permission while reminding him that the matter should be resolved promptly. The meeting ended without further discussion. When the guard stepped back into the corridor, the air felt cooler, the stone beneath his boots carrying the faint chill of evening. He walked slowly toward the security office, his thoughts measured, deliberate. He knew that altering the report would close the matter officially, removing it from further review. He also knew that leaving it unchanged would likely provoke further pressure, perhaps reassignment away from the residential wing, perhaps formal reprimand. The palace around him continued in its usual rhythm, servants moving quietly, distant voices echoing in high halls, the muted chime of a clock marking the hour. Nothing in that ordered world revealed the decision that now rested on a single guard, a decision that would determine whether the small, silent signs he had observed would vanish into the routine of palace life or remain, preserved in record, waiting for someone with the authority to act upon them. The guard did not amend the report that evening. Instead, he left it in its original form, flagged but not altered, and completed the remainder of his shift with the same precision he applied to any duty. Outwardly, nothing changed. He responded to routine calls, checked doors and access points, and signed the patrol logs with the same steady hand. Yet beneath that calm routine, he began to work within the narrow boundaries still available to him. Palace regulations allowed guards to adjust patrol routes for the purpose of verifying secondary access points, provided the changes were logged and did not leave primary corridors uncovered. It was a minor clause, rarely invoked, intended for maintenance checks rather than investigations. Before the start of the next shift, he filed a route adjustment, citing the need to inspect a service passage connected to the school wing, a corridor seldom used except by maintenance staff and occasionally by tutors moving materials between classrooms. The request required no special approval. It was routine enough to pass unnoticed. The passage lay behind a narrow door set into a wall of carved paneling, a door designed to blend into the architecture so completely that most visitors never noticed it. When the guard opened it, a cooler current of air flowed outward, carrying the faint scent of stone and dust. The corridor beyond was narrower than the main halls, lit by small recessed lamps that cast soft, uneven pools of light along the floor. The temperature dropped several degrees, and the quiet here felt different from the deliberate stillness of the school wing. This was the natural silence of a place rarely disturbed. He walked slowly, his steps echoing faintly against the walls. The passage ran parallel to the outer edge of the school wing, intersecting at intervals with concealed service doors and storage alcoves. At each junction, he paused to check the access indicators and door seals. Most showed no recent activity. One, however, displayed a faint smudge near the handle, as if touched by an ungloved hand. The mark was small, easily overlooked, but in a palace where staff were trained to maintain immaculate order, such details stood out. He recorded the observation and continued. Farther along, he reached a point where the passage turned sharply, leading toward a secondary stairwell that connected to administrative offices above. As he approached the corner, he heard voices ahead, low, indistinct, but unmistakably human. He stopped at once, remaining in the shadow of a wall recess, listening without moving closer. The voices were not raised. They carried the controlled tone of a private conversation, the kind held by people accustomed to being overheard and therefore careful with their words. One voice belonged to an adult male, measured and authoritative. The other, softer, responded in brief replies that suggested deference. The guard could not see them from where he stood, but the sound carried clearly in the corridor. He focused on the fragments he could hear, resisting the instinct to step forward. The words were not immediately revealing, references to schedules, to maintaining discretion, to ensuring that the arrangements remained confined to a specific wing. Then the male voice spoke a sentence that caused the guard's attention to sharpen. The authority has already been delegated. There is no need to involve the tutors or the household physician. The response came after a pause, hesitant, as if the other speaker were uncertain but unwilling to object. The guard felt the familiar tightening in his chest again, the sense that small irregularities were aligning into something more coherent and more troubling. The conversation continued, the speakers unaware of his presence. The male voice spoke of maintaining discipline, of preserving the dignity of the household, of avoiding unnecessary reports that might invite interference from security channels. The phrasing was careful, indirect, yet the implication was clear enough. Decisions concerning the child were being handled privately, outside the formal safeguards that normally governed any action involving a member of the royal family. The guard remained motionless, aware that any movement might echo along the corridor and reveal him. After several minutes, footsteps sounded, moving away toward the stairwell. A door opened, then closed softly, and the passage fell silent again. Only then did the guard step forward, moving cautiously to the corner. The stairwell door stood closed, its access panel dark, indicating it had been opened from the inside without a recorded scan, possible only with a manual override key held by a limited number of senior staff. He examined the panel, noting the faint warmth of recently handled metal. Again he recorded the detail, speaking quietly into his log. None of what he had heard constituted direct evidence of wrongdoing. Authority within the palace was often delegated for practical reasons. Yet the deliberate exclusion of physicians, tutors, and security channels suggested an arrangement designed to avoid oversight. As he retraced his steps through the passage, the cool air seemed heavier, carrying the weight of what he now understood. The injuries he had observed, the erased log entries, the pressure to amend reports, and now the confirmation that disciplinary authority had been informally transferred, each element alone might have been explained. Together they formed a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. When the guard emerged into the main corridor, the palace felt different to him, not outwardly changed, but subtly altered in meaning. The ordered movement of attendants, the quiet conversations, the measured pace of daily life all continued, yet he was now aware that within that order, decisions were being made beyond the reach of the systems designed to protect the most vulnerable. That awareness carried its own weight, not dramatic or overwhelming, but steady and persistent. He returned to the security office and secured his private observations in a restricted file, ensuring that the recordings of the overheard conversation were preserved with precise timestamps and location data. As he completed the entry, he understood that what lay ahead would not be resolved quietly or quickly. The next step, escalating the matter beyond the level where it could be suppressed, would place him in direct conflict with those who preferred the matter to remain unseen. And once taken, that step could not be undone. The guard waited until the following morning to act, not out of hesitation, but out of discipline. Escalation within the palace security structure required more than suspicion or fragments of overheard conversation. It required a record that could not be dismissed as interpretation. He spent the early hours of his shift reviewing every observation he had logged over the previous 2 days, checking times, cross-referencing access records, and verifying that each entry was supported by objective detail. The handprint in the school wing, the missing 11 minutes in the local access logs, the ribbon recovered from the corridor, the visible injuries, the altered report request, and the unrecorded use of a manual override in the service stairwell. None of these alone constituted proof of abuse or misconduct. Together, however, they established a pattern of irregularities involving a minor under royal protection, and palace regulations were explicit on one point. Any documented pattern suggesting harm to a child required a mandatory welfare review, and such a review, once formally requested through the correct channel, could not be suppressed by household administrators. The procedure was rarely invoked, and precisely for that reason it carried weight. He prepared the submission carefully, attaching only verifiable evidence, omitting the overheard conversation itself, but noting the unexplained use of restricted access points. The request was routed not through the household office that had attempted to amend his report, but through the Central Security Directorate, whose authority derived directly from the royal charter governing palace safety. When he transmitted the file, the confirmation appeared within minutes, followed by a brief message acknowledging receipt and assigning the case a priority classification that required immediate review. The efficiency of the response contrasted sharply with the silence that had followed his earlier report, and the difference confirmed what he had already suspected. The delay had not been procedural, but intentional. By midday, 2 senior security officers arrived in the residential wing, accompanied by a medical examiner accredited to conduct welfare assessments of minors. Their presence was discreet, their manner professional, and their arrival was explained to attendants as a routine inspection. The guard remained at his post as they passed, exchanging only formal acknowledgments, yet he felt a quiet sense of gravity in the air, as if the palace itself were holding its breath. Within the hour, the heir was escorted to a private examination room. The process unfolded without raised voices or visible tension, yet the stillness in the surrounding corridors deepened, the attendants speaking more softly than usual, the ordinary sounds of the wing subdued. The guard continued his patrol, aware that the matter was now beyond his direct control, yet also aware that the outcome depended on the evidence being recorded without interference. The formal findings were not announced publicly, but in the late afternoon the guard was summoned to provide a statement confirming his observations in his reports. The interview was conducted in a small conference room, the atmosphere calm and methodical. He answered each question precisely, describing only what he had seen, the times and locations, the physical details. The investigators did not press for interpretation, they required only clarity. When the statement was complete, one of the officers informed him that the injuries had been formally documented and that the welfare review had triggered a broader inquiry into the delegation of disciplinary authority within the household. Several administrative privileges had already been suspended pending investigation, and external child welfare authorities, whose jurisdiction extended to all minors within the kingdom, regardless of rank, had been notified, as required by law. The guard listened without comment, acknowledging the information with a brief nod. As he left the room, he felt neither relief nor triumph, only a quiet steadiness, the sense that a process had been set in motion that would now proceed according to rules stronger than individual preference or influence. In the days that followed, subtle changes appeared throughout the palace. Access protocols for the school wing were revised. Now every entry required dual authorization and automatic logging. Medical staff were assigned permanent oversight of all instructional areas used by children. Training sessions were scheduled for attendants and tutors, emphasizing the procedures for reporting injuries or unusual behavior without delay. None of these measures were announced as consequences of a single incident, yet their purpose was evident to those who understood the sequence of events. The guard returned to his regular duties, his patrol routes unchanged, his role outwardly the same. Occasionally he saw the Heir in the corridor, moving more freely now, the stiffness in the gait gradually diminishing, the guarded expression replaced by a cautious but visible ease. They never spoke of what had happened. Such matters were not discussed openly, and none was necessary. One evening, as the guard completed a routine check in the school wing, he paused for a moment in the corridor where he had first seen the faint handprint on the wall. The surface had been repainted, the marks erased, the room restored to its orderly appearance. Yet he knew that the true record of what had occurred was not in the walls or the floors, but in the system of safeguards now strengthened, in the procedures revised, and in the quiet understanding among those responsible for the palace's safety that vigilance often began with the smallest irregularity. He turned off the corridor light, closed the door, and resumed his patrol, the steady echo of his footsteps fading into the calm, watchful silence of the palace at night.